This documentary is not about the Vietnam War. It is instead about the men and women who fought in that war and the shameful way some were treated when they came home. Telling the story of the lost homecoming when our Vietnam veterans came home is part of their healing process.
World War I troops returning from overseas in 1919 were met by cheering crowds who welcomed them home as heroes. Throngs of people lined Fifth Avenue in New York City as the troops proudly marched by, led by their commander, General John Pershing. They were met by bands and huge crowds of 2 million plus cheering them on. 25,000 troops representing all who had served in the war proudly paraded by. The troops were about to be discharged from the military, but first a victory parade was held so they could be honored and thanked for their service. The parade allowed an adoring public to shower them with respect and adoration. Pershing held a similar parade in Washington 2 days later. Troops returning home from World War II were proudly paraded down the same route as those who came home from World War I. The 82nd Airborne Division was the unit selected to represent all of the military in World War II and was led by Major General James Gavin, the youngest two-star general of the war. Cheering crowds lined both sides of the parade home, showering the troops returning from overseas with appreciation and respect for their service in World War II. There were many similarities between those who served in World War I and World War II. First of all, in both wars, returning troops were praised and honored for their service. In both wars, most of the troops remained in the same unit for much of the war. They trained together, left together, fought together in the war, and returned home together. A cohesive bond held the men together and gave them a sense of security. In both wars, they were welcomed home as conquering heroes. When World War II troops came home, the respect, appreciation, and gratitude for them was so great that wherever they went, they had their bar tabs picked up, meals paid for, and were offered free rides home. Excited crowds waved and shouted their praise and support to the troops. Office workers lay on rooftops to view the parade below. And on the street, parents held their children high so they could see the brave warriors proudly march by. Veterans of World War I and II were met by crowds greeting them as returning heroes, while Vietnam veterans were met by hostile crowds criticizing them for fighting in an unjust and immoral war. Simply put, the deck was stacked against Vietnam veterans. They were sent to fight a war in which large segments of the local population saw them as foreign invaders propping up a corrupt government controlled by the United States. The American public eventually turned against the war and misdirected their opposition to it onto those who fought it. In the end, it was a war that America lost, unlike World War I and World War II.
I started watching the news and I got a feeling about how hated we really were, baby killers, and mass murderers. I mean, it's just everything you could hear about was on the television, it was in the newspaper. And I said, I don't know where it's coming from.
We were advised not to wear our uniforms when we got stateside, and that didn't set well with me. I was proud of my uniform.
Over 2.5 million Americans served in Vietnam. Many of them left their family, quit their jobs, and dropped out of college to serve in the war. For many, it was a life-changing experience as they faced the prospect of fighting in combat and dying. The very survival of our country depends on citizens answering our country's call to serve in time of war. The 1960s was a chaotic period for America. Great changes were occurring in civil rights. New freedoms were being realized as the young generation broke with established mores.
I'm Dr. Harold Dawley. The idea for this documentary began approximately 40 years ago, early in my career as a Veterans Affairs psychologist. It was a time in which an increasing number of Vietnam veterans with mental and emotional problems were turning to the Veterans Affairs medical system for help. I spent most of my clinical career at the New Orleans Veterans Affairs Medical Center, where I had the pleasure of working with a number of Vietnam veterans. What impressed me at the time and has stood out in my memory over the years is the hurt, resentment, and bitterness many Vietnam veterans shared with me over how they were treated when they came home. I could not forget it, and over time began to intuitively feel a negative homecoming was somehow related to the poor post-war adjustment some were experiencing. I kept thinking it was a story that needed to be told. Only recently has research appeared showing a relationship between a Vietnam veteran's homecoming experience and his or her post-war adjustment. This research found a significant correlation between a negative homecoming and the severity of PTSD symptoms among a substantial minority of Vietnam veterans.
There was signs, there was communists, baby killers, murderers, you name it. Throwing eggs at the bus, the whole 9 yards.
People, were calling us different names and baby killers and stuff, It just started changing for the Vietnam vets about the last 5 years, But today it's still a sore subject. Vietnam is still a sore subject with a lot of people,
Oh, well, it's horrible. I mean, you're a hero. No matter what you did in Vietnam, you went, you were a hero.
When the World War II vets came back, you saw parades and people hugging and kissing. When Vietnam came back, nothing.
What the public felt about us, we didn't like it. None of us did. We talked about it in Vietnam, what was going on, about the war, people demonstrating against the war.
Your family's not going to tell you none of this that was going on. So you can imagine the shock when we got back home. Now, I never did get spit on, but it was called baby killers, and I got these looks, and you was ashamed to wear a uniform. That's the pressure you got. I came home, I walked into the hangout where I'd been, and people came up to me and they said, "Man, where have you been?" I said, "Vietnam." Oh, they backed off like you were contagious.
A lot of the veterans that I knew couldn't handle the way they were treated. I knew people that were spit on.
The name calling I can take, but he spit on me, on my shoes.
We didn't ask for a thank you, but it would have been nice, a little pat on the back, say welcome home. Because there was a lot of us over there wounded, a lot of us killed. We lost our friends, our relatives, and it was tough coming back to this country where they didn't want you to even come back.
We knew we were together as a unit, and we had to do what we did to survive. And we were proud to be Marines fighting in a war.
There's Vietnam veterans everywhere that feel like they were kicked in the teeth for doing a job they were told to do.
When our country calls, us Americans have always answered that call.
I get a lot of people, especially younger people, younger being anybody under 30, and they say, "Thank you for your service." And at first it was kind of neat, And then after a while it turned into, where the hell were you 45 years ago?
I mean, think of the word liberty and all of the wars that we've fought for to preserve this liberty. And it's a job that, I guess we'll be doing forever. And you're doing it, you're doing it for this individual and that individual, but you're doing it for your country.
We came back, but we was treated like we was the cause of the war. And in a movie that Sylvester Stallone said, that all we wanted was our company to love us the way we loved it.
Many of us who served in Vietnam did not fully understand why we were there. All we knew was that we were called to serve by our country, and we answered that call, regardless of how we felt about the war. Since many of us did not understand why we were fighting, it is understandable how the American public did not understand the war. Opposition to the Vietnam War evolved into a social movement, including different causes such as civil rights, organized labor, women's rights, among others, along with members of the clergy, physicians, academia, journalists, and even former members of the military who served in Vietnam. The daily images of Americans fighting and dying in Vietnam, coupled with the harm to the civilian population, was just too much for the American public and resulted in loss of support for the war. Protests began on college campuses, and the Kent State University tragedy in which National Guard troops killed 4 college students protesting the war was the final straw.
Veterans fighting for their country, I mean, it's the only honorable thing to do is to respect the man for that.
A lot of folks don't realize that we were obligated to be there by our government.
We were upset that these protesters were protesting us, and we were soldiers doing our job.
It was another way of them protesting the war, was to protest us. I guess. I mean, they didn't know me. I didn't know them. And we damn sure didn't do what they said we did.
I heard there may be some demonstrations against the war, and that did not sink well in my head, because who would be opposed to those troops who were over there doing exactly what their government told them to do?
As the war goes on and body bags start coming back, the negative starts to kick in. Same with Vietnam. It became a war that was people were seeing in their living room on TV. So no one can go to the White House and knock on the door and say, hey, I got a complaint. The soldiers become the targets.
You know, there was anti-war sentiment going on right then, and even the people that didn't really have a problem with the war still shunned you. You know, that's what I felt like. I was shunned. So it's one of those things where, you know, you don't have any control over any of that, so you just might as well just move on.
You can see the ticker tape parades, and these guys were obviously heroes. I mean, that was a great generation of people, you know, and they really sacrificed a lot. So I have no animosity that they got ticker tapes, we didn't.
If people just had a smidgen idea of what those guys went through, especially in Vietnam, what we experienced was more than enough for us. And I know in many cases they had problems that we never had, but I think it's disgraceful, just absolutely disgraceful.
World War II, you were heroes when you came home. We were certainly not heroes. I mean, my friends respected me and loved me, but it's a different time.
When my father came back from the war, and everyone was in support of the veterans who came back from World War II, after the Vietnam War, because of the dissension and opposition to the war, it was a very different kind of situation.
The Vietnam War was a very frustrating experience for those of us who fought it. Should we feel guilty for not winning the war?
And one of the very effective things to do is to remind them of what they did. And the best way to do that is to start off by saying, hey fellas, do you realize that in all the wars fought by the United States since 1775, that our war is the only war where we never lost a battle. We never lost a battle, yet we did not prevail in the war. So why is that? We certainly weren't fighting against a ragtag enemy. We were fighting against the number 4 army in the world, and that was the North Vietnamese army. So We prevailed everywhere we went, and the flaw of not prevailing in our final goal doesn't rest with you, it rests with the policies that we were following.
At an individual level, the primary goal of many of us in Vietnam was to keep ourselves and buddies alive, out in the field or even in a secure base. It was difficult to tell if the war was being won or lost, as different units frequently fought for land, suffered high casualties, only to vacate it and then come back and fight for it again. Many times what we did just didn't make sense, but we followed orders and did it.
If you're in combat, you're in a war and you have an objective, the end of the tunnel, that if you go here, 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 and here, this will be over with. Well, if you have an objective like that, then there's high morale. But when you're just fighting aggression or you're engaging an enemy and you defeat him in battle today, but he'll be back 3 weeks from now and you're going to have to retake the same ground, that's a killer. And because men know that, well, tomorrow I might be killed in the same spot that I was successful today.
Television brought the war to America's living rooms, increasing concern among parents of military-aged children who voiced their concern their sons might be forced to fight in the war. The opposition grew as many Americans started believing the war was unjustified. Compounding all these factors was the limited support to help returning Vietnam veterans adjust to civilian life, in contrast to those coming home from our 2 world wars. In the early 1970s, much of the VA mental health community did not fully understand PTSD and the best ways to treat it. Most returning veterans were left on their own to make the adjustment from war to peace. Many who returned home with emotional distress self-medicated by turning to alcohol and drugs, where they had turned before they even turned in their uniforms. While most of us were able to adjust from war to civilian life, a substantial minority of us have not been so fortunate. The post-war adjustment of this group is worse than that of veterans of the same era that did not serve in Vietnam, as well as veterans of most of our previous wars. Years ago, I had some thoughts about my own experiences in Vietnam. The Vietnam War was the first television war, and we didn't play well in Peoria. The politicians connected intravenously to the poll takers, therefore ordered us to win the war quietly. This we could not do, but many who were there promised themselves to win the aftermath of that war quietly, and many have done just that. At first, it was easy to do because what America wanted most from us was quiet. We came back to those who didn't care or understand or care to understand. And none of us wore our uniforms in public too much. We were changed, all right, all of us. From the all-night disc jockey on the Armed Forces radio network in Saigon to the all-night machine gunner in the Ashu Valley. Never again would most of us have the same faith in America's willingness to make the same sacrifices it asked of its soldiers. Never again would the mundane concerns and vapid rhythms of civilian society count the same on our spiritual abacuses. We brought those changes back to America's bedrooms and boardrooms and barrooms. With us, as our families and friends can attest, the war and the times had changed them too, and the moral flux often made for a combustible mixture when we and they came together. The resultant flames licked at the lives of every Vietnam veteran, fueled even more by the perception that we, who had never lost a major battle, had lost the war. What remained? A destroyed self-image or only a damaged one? The answer largely depended on accident, because each veteran's experiences and ability to cope was different. But most veterans found ways to assess the damage and repair it. Many, of course, could not make the necessary corrections. No spouse or supervisor could absorb their rage and boredom. And these are the veterans who haunt our nation's highways and hospitals, searching for an innocent's first loss at places like Xuan Loc or Hue or Pleiku, and finally, how to turn back the feeling of having been ill-used by America. These individual victories were achieved in secret because for too many years, America remained closed to traumas, hardships, separations, and bereavements that are part of the psyche of every Vietnam veteran. All that has changed as we've moved further away from the fall of Saigon. Writers and television producers now can't seem to get their fill of probing those psyches and hearing those long ignored horror stories. Replacing the aimlessness and disappointments of the Vietnam experience has come easy to no veterans. To many, that replacement will never come, and their stories are the pathetic ones America has heard for too long. But know too that there are many veterans who have long ago swallowed their own stories and probably don't want them told. A majority of those who served in Vietnam have that security, hard-won from the bitterness of their own hearts, and they have that particular greatness. It's not likely that their stories will be much heard in the current spate of Vietnam tale-telling, but it's not really necessary for America to hear them. It is only necessary to know that they are there.
The act of killing others, willingly facing the prospect of being killed or wounded, and witnessing close friends being killed, can traumatize most of us. Each experience exacts a price, and for many, the final toll may be a post-traumatic stress disorder, a term author Tom Glenn describes as a wound to the soul that never heals.
PTSD is like a dormant disease. It's there. It has its potential. Sometimes it erupts. Sometimes it doesn't. I believe that the people that were most affected by it were men who came home to little or nothing. Maybe came home to a past that had led them into the service to begin with. Came home to no family. Folks that came home like myself to a wife and children and parents and a loving home, you had 3 steps up on it. And so I don't think I was ever affected by it. I got on with my life. I said I need to do something else and did.
The quality of the homecoming experience of veterans returning from combat can mitigate the trauma of combat and lessen their likelihood of developing PTSD, or at least reducing its severity. Warriors coming home to praise, support, and acceptance can experience a moral cleansing of being forgiven for real or imagined sins. Such a homecoming can be vindication of what they did or did not do in combat, lifting the burden of guilt and other emotional distress many carry home with them. A positive homecoming is also an acceptance of the returning warrior back into community and society. We are fortunate in having input in this documentary from two leading authorities who are actually Vietnam combat veterans who went on to earn their PhD and become leading researchers on the relationship between a negative homecoming and the severity of PTSD symptoms. Dr. Joseph Bascarino served in the Vietnam Central Highlands as an artilleryman in 1966. At the time of this documentary, Dr. Bascarino's new research had not been published, so he did not discuss it in detail, but allowed us to quote him as stating, "Our preliminary results suggest that a negative homecoming experience among veterans decades earlier appears to be associated with higher rates of current PTSD among veterans, which is amazing to us, given the time span involved. Further research is planned." Another Vietnam veteran, Dr. Charles Figley, served in the Marine Corps and also earned his PhD and went on to become a leading researcher in PTSD. Dr. Figley describes some of the research on the relationship between a negative homecoming and the severity of PTSD symptoms among Vietnam veterans.
So how many of you had a fantastic homecoming and you wouldn't trade it for the world? Raise your hand. Look around, look around. Raise them high. The research that's emerged in the last 10 years, and especially in the last 5 years, confirmed the importance of the homecoming. And they identified 4 factors, and one of the 4 factors was the quality of the homecoming. The quality of the homecoming was really associated with how much you felt welcomed back and how much you feel safe as a result of being back. John Rowan, who's the president of VVA, said he's been going to these conferences for 14 years, and the percentage of Marines who show up has decreased significantly. And I think part of that is that Marines had an especially challenging time during the war. For me, I felt a tremendous amount of pride and expected some degree of respect. When I came back from war, I certainly got it from my father and other World War II veterans that knew me at least. But we got just the opposite of that with regard to peace rallies and condemnation. A very important study was published this year, but I've known about it for a long time. It's a follow-up of a study that I participated in and I assisted in as a part of a VA working group. So they went back and they studied the same people that were studied back in the 80s. And they found a number of very important factors associated with predicting PTSD. One of the only four variables that accounted for most of the variance with regard to PTSD symptoms. And guess what that factor was? It was about the quality of the homecoming. Quality of the homecoming. Because the quality of the homecoming suggested how appreciated you are. The quality of the homecoming is associated with your outlook on life, your ability to incorporate your military experiences, to not be ashamed because people were marching against the war, because they had, in those days, mixing up the war with the warrior. Exactly.
We was the problem, not the war itself, and which is not really true. I mean, you know, anybody that knows military knows that you follow orders. It's just that simple.
All we could do was follow the orders we received, and we did so to the best of our ability.
Once I started going to the VA and realizing that I had a problem, I could break down that probably 50 to 75% of my PTSD stemmed from coming home from Vietnam the first time. Because of the way I was treated, the way I wasn't treated, you know, the lack of being treated, and And then again, the way you was treated. Harshly.
Some people literally did get spit on and literally did get treated badly. A lot of guys burned their uniforms the second they got out of the base. Most people didn't. You flew back home on reduced rates because you were in the service, but a lot of guys didn't want to take it because they would, didn't want to be hassled.
One positive trend is the growing numbers of communities that are having their own welcome homecoming events for their Vietnam veterans. One such community is the small Mississippi town of Pass Christian, 75 miles east of New Orleans on the Mississippi Gulf Coast.
After nearly 40 years, Vietnam veterans were welcomed home, and this time it was a good experience. Mike Lacey reports that the Pass Christian event did a lot to heal the wounds that can't be seen.
The city of Pass Christian and the VFW post celebrated the service and honored the sacrifices of Vietnam veterans from South Mississippi the way it should have been done nearly 40 years ago.
I'd like to welcome you and thank you for coming to honor our Vietnam veterans and to give them a homecoming that a lot of them did not get.
You are the fitting people that we need to honor today, and we are very, very thankful for your services. We know how hard you fought, the enemy that you fought, and what you did for us. So once again, we appreciate you, not just Pass Christian, everybody on Mississippi Gulf Coast. Thank you very much.
About 50 Vietnam veterans were honored in the ceremony in front of friends and family members.
It's never too soon to say thank you. It's never wrong to say thank you loudly. It brings home for those of us who did not go the incredible bravery on your part, the incredible sacrifice on your part, the horror of warfare, the horror of what happened to you, what happened to your friends. And I guess the greatest horror was that our nation at the time did not fully appreciate your efforts. And I do appreciate efforts like this to say thank you. And because we can never say thank you often enough, it needs to be said every day.
It was also an opportunity for veteran psychologist and filmmaker Dr. Harold Dawley to create a documentary about the negative experiences Vietnam veterans faced after their service was over.
Men and women in combat frequently come home with guilt, survivor guilt, over what they did or did not do. All of that can be mitigated if they come home welcomed as heroes. Guys coming back from Vietnam weren't treated that way. They came home with hostility at worst and indifference at best.
You know, there wasn't any bands playing and nobody saying, welcome home and greeting you for the services that you were in and what you gave to your country. So this really means a lot to us,
Thank you for serving our country when you were called, and especially at a time when it was not popular to heed the call. But like your fathers before you, you put your dreams on hold for our nation. Before answering Uncle Sam's call, many of you had probably never traveled outside of your state, and definitely not outside of your country. You were sent to Vietnam, a place somewhere on the other side of the world. And most troubling, you were sent for a reason that most Americans question. And after so many in America turned their backs on you, you taught Americans that no matter how they feel about a particular war or conflict or military operation, that we need to honor, respect the men and women who answer the call and put their lives on the line. And today, we see that attitude as we welcome those home who have served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere in the world. This is a very special opportunity for me to say something to a group that I don't have enough opportunities to say, and that most of you have probably not heard enough. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
During the 60s, one song was a notable exception to the anti-war music permeating the media at home and in Vietnam. It was a song honoring our military, and it remained the #1 top hit for 6 weeks in 1966 and went on to be the most successful song of the 1960s. That song was The Ballad of the Green Berets. It was written and sung by Staff Sergeant Barry Sadler, a Green Beret fighting in Vietnam. This song significantly lifted the spirits of the military everywhere and brought it new respect from the public.
Barry Sadler was very, very talented. He wrote the song in 68, I believe it was, 67 to 68. When we came back, we had a party. He said, I want to sing you a song. He sang the Ballad of the Green Beret the first time. And there was about 200 of us there, and it just went wild.
Retired Army Command Sergeant Major Paul Larson, who also served a tour in the Green Berets, will sing the Ballad of the Green Berets.
Fighting soldiers from the sky, fearless men who jump and die.
Men who mean just what they say, the brave men of the Green Beret. Silver wings upon their chest, these are men, America's best. 100 men will test today, but only 3 win the Green Beret. Trained to live off nature's land, trained in combat hand to hand. Men who fight by night and day, courage take from the Green Beret. Silver wings upon their chest, these are men, America's best. 100 men will test today, but only 3 win the Green Beret. Back at home, a young wife waits. Her Green Beret has met his fate. He has died for those oppressed, leaving her this last request. Put silver wings on my son's chest, make him one of America's best. He'll be a man they'll test one day, have him win the Green Beret.
We appreciate what y'all are doing for us to bring us back and to let us know you appreciate us. That means a lot to us.
Event today, it was beyond all expectations for me. I really enjoyed it and got a good feeling from it.
To have a whole community come out, not just a single person shaking your hand telling you thank you, a whole community to come out and tell you thank you. It's a good feeling.
For the last 10 to 20 years, there has been a growing number of communities honoring and welcoming home their Vietnam veterans. It seems the further away we move from the generation that failed to adequately welcome home our Vietnam veterans, the more subsequent generations are motivated to do so. There seems to be almost a collective feeling of guilt among those that failed to welcome us home.
As the war progressed, things only got worse for the veterans. Unlike today, where everybody, doesn't matter whether they're pro or anti or anything with regards to the wars that we've been fighting for the last 12, 15 years, everybody likes the warriors. Everybody says we should, take care of the veterans when they come home and all of that. And frankly, we feel that we've played some part in that because of the way the Vietnam vets were treated when they came home.
I was home 2 days from Vietnam. I seen in the paper there was a corpsman that had gotten killed. They were having a funeral. I put on my uniform, I went down to the funeral home, and the father asked me, he said, "Do you know this? Do you know my son?" I said, "No, but I have great respect for Corman, and I wanted to come and pay my respect." Him and I kind of broke down together. He said, "You are the only person that's home on leave that's bothered to come down and pay their respects to my son."
This time you are not greeted with ridicule. This time you are welcomed home with open arms for the great things that you have done and furthered the honor of our nation and your devotion to duty. And how fitting again is it that you walk across this field after the brutal conditions of war that you faced, where everyday bravery, integrity, teamwork, dedication, selfless service were tested and time again passed by those before you. How fitting is it that you are here today with us, and how great for us here to be able to welcome you home.
How Vietnam veterans were treated coming home is a sad story with one positive result. Their homecoming was so negative, many of them made it a point to start going to airports so they could properly welcome veterans returning home from subsequent wars. They proudly stood with their hand outstretched and a warm smile as they said, "Thank you for your service." They started a trend that continues to this day. Chances are high anyone in a military uniform or any veteran with a cap, shirt, or something identifying themselves as a veteran can expect to hear, "Thank you for your service."
That's one of the big things that the Vietnam veterans do, remembering their own experience. Remember, the Vietnam wasn't the first war after World War II. Korea was there. But it was the first war where the veteran was roundly criticized. So we didn't want this to happen to the modern day veterans. And those veterans will tell you, hey, we get together with some Viet guys and it's a lot better.
Another factor in reflecting on the Vietnam War is the importance of keeping troops in the same unit for as long as possible so they can benefit from the social support and binding that occurs.
Deployment of a combat force, meaning the men who will become veterans, is always a key thing. At the beginning of the Vietnam War, we had a deployment schedule that went as units. And units went over completely and they came back completely after a year or 13-month service. And that plan works well because there's this camaraderie, there's this homogeneous melding of the unit, and it works well until you have casualties. Now, once you have casualties, you start getting replacements, and the more casualties you have for whatever reason, whether it's non-battle casualties, battle casualties, but a man is incapacitated, he needs to be replaced. Well, then now you have a mix of the people who went over initially, and you have those who replaced them, who now are going to come home at a different time. So the goal of deploying as a unit and coming back as a unit, it's an honorable one, and it's one that you should attain, is unrealistic unless you put in the scenario you're going to have no casualties. Now, a way to perhaps mitigate that is to pull units out from combat as a unit and replace with a unit, much like the Marines did in the war in the Pacific in World War II.
The good news is the majority of us who served in Vietnam are doing well. Most of us have been able to make the adjustments from the military to civilian life. We either furthered our education or got a job, settled down, got married, and moved on. In my case, I was able to land a great job doing something I loved, working as a commentator at a newspaper and on radio and TV. Yes, some of us still have a sore spot in our heart over how we were treated coming home, and some of us are still struggling with the aftermath of the war. We are mindful of those of us still hurting, but all in all, most of us are doing okay. John McCain served 5.5 years in a harsh North Vietnam prison. But it didn't stop this former Navy pilot from becoming a respected U.S. Senator and almost becoming President of the United States. Another presidential hopeful, former Secretary of State John Kerry, also served with distinction in Vietnam. Then look at those successful in business like Bob Parsons, who was wounded in Vietnam while serving in the Marines and returned home to find GoDaddy, the international internet services company. Or Fred Smith, who after picking up a Silver Star, Bronze Star, and 2 Purple Hearts during 2 tours in Vietnam, went on to found FedEx. How about Dave Liniger, who after serving in Vietnam started flipping houses, became a real estate agent, and went on to found Remax. 2 of the most successful movies about the Vietnam War, Platoon and Born on the 4th of July, were directed by Oliver Stone, who served 15 months in the infantry in Vietnam. Then there's Roger Staubach, another Vietnam veteran, who led the Dallas Cowboys to 2 Super Bowl titles. To me, those of us who served in Vietnam are doing okay. Are we all perfect? Nah. Are we all saints? Definitely not. We're like the rest of America. Some of us who served in Vietnam had and may still have problems related to our service there. The exposure to combat can be rough and lead to problems that can last a lifetime. A negative homecoming can add to the burden a small number of us still carry to this day. But look at society in general, and on the whole, most of us that served in Vietnam are really not that different from society in general. One more thing we can't control is Father Time, and he's catching up with us. It's been estimated only 1/3 of us that served in Vietnam are alive today. There may be fewer of us as our ranks are thinning, but those of us here are still proud of answering our country's call in time of war.
When we had the New York City Welcome Home Parade in 1985 and built our memorial in '85 and dedicated it, we raised a ton of money on Wall Street, over $5 million just on Wall Street. And what shocked everybody was how many Vietnam vets worked on Wall Street. And they had all these guys who were executive VPs and brokers and all this other stuff who were Vietnam veterans that nobody knew, hadn't a clue. And they all came out of the closet when we did this memorial. And that was very interesting.
Our greatest treasure are the heroes among us, our veterans. Without those who answered our country's call in times of war and those who stood vigilant in times of peace, our democracy would not be the beacon of freedom to the rest of the world. We must honor our military and its veterans, for they are the ones who protect us and guarantee our American way of living. Our way of living is not perfect, and we need to do better in a number of areas. But in terms of much of the world, our democracy stands as a shining example of freedom and prosperity. Yes, our Vietnam veterans have come home, and we need to continue to respect and honor them and all of our veterans for their service. It has taken a while, but an increasing number of Vietnam veterans are being recognized and appreciated for their service. Not all of the bad memories have faded away, but being thanked and respected by our country has healed some of the wounds.
mountain majesty, above the fruited plain. America, America, God shed His grace on thee, and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea.
Yes, America is beautiful and is the land of the free. We must not forget freedom comes at a price, and that price is paid by our military and its veterans. We must all make an effort to regularly thank active members of our military as well as our veterans for their service. The freedom we cherish is earned by those who risk their lives in our defense. All of us have relatives, friends, neighbors, or acquaintances who are Vietnam veterans. Make it a point to thank them for their service by simply saying, "Thank you for your service in Vietnam." Reach out to the Vietnam veterans and all veterans in your community and thank them for their service.